Piermarini, Donald. They call me Muggsy. I've had that since a child, and it's still with me. And some of you probably know that that's my nickname. Been living here all my life, and I'm very familiar with the sacred ground. And did you notice the word I used? Sacred ground. Because it has a unique history. But before I can tell you about the history of the place, let me explain where I got my information from. There were a series of sources that we looked into. Now, Evelyn Hashey is a member of the commission, and she did a lot of research, and she did it years ago, and I've been using that information to read over. Actually, our historian on the commission, by the way, this is the Leominster Historical Commission. We're associated with City Hall. Okay, we're a government agency. There's 7 of us. And Chet Carter is supposed to be standing right here. But Chet Carter has to go to a funeral this morning, so he asked me to sit in for him. So I'll do the best I can. Okay, folks? Can you all hear me all right?
Yes.
I'm a little bit familiar with the talk like this, though I'm not a historian. I used to be a ranger on Cape Cod, so I do know how to speak to groups like this. Also a teacher for 37 years, but I taught sciences. I'm not a historian. But to get back to this sacred property, it's been isolated for a long time. And actually, way back as far as 1675, that's when it was first really looked into. And if any of you are familiar with this book, and that is the story of Mrs. Mary Rowlandson. Well, she was captured by Metacomet. Metacomet was the son of Massasoit, and of course Massasoit was friendly with the American pilgrims that landed at Plymouth. Well, he had a son, and they called him King Philip. Well, King Philip in 1675, decided to do away with the settlers. And they did a good job, an excellent job. In fact, all the way through Lancaster into the outskirts of Boston. But his coalition didn't hold, and that was the end of King Philip. But the result was that the veterans at that time were offered grants of land, and some of those grants are here still yet in Notown. Now, Notown was not a very good place to live. It was hard scrabble. If you look around, it's hilly, it's gravel, it's not a very good place to farm. And so the soil was poor. They didn't stay that long. And then there was a series of other wars that occurred, and more settlers came in. I'm sure you're probably familiar with 1690. There was a French and Indian War called the King William's. And in 1702, there was another one, French and Indian and British, because these were from England, and that controversy between France and England persisted here, and the settlers were involved. And when they were involved, their heirs or they acquired grants here in Notown. So we've been having grants here for a long period of time, but not too many of them stayed. In fact, very few of them stayed. To get back to Mary Rowlandson, you'll have to excuse me if I just wander around a little bit. They probably passed through this area when they captured Mary Rowlandson. King Philip went to the other side of Notown, and you're all familiar with their stone there on Route 140. And many of you have probably seen that stone where the transfer took place, where Mary was, they had to bring up some money, pay King Philip and his is Indians and pay for Mary to come back. Okay? It's, are you, any of you familiar with that stone? Do you know the name of it? Redemption Rock. It's still there, and I think the trustees of reservation have control over it. I'm not sure. I think it's the trustees of reservation. Yes. In fact, the trustees of reservation have a lot of control over this property too, along with the city of Leominster, DPW, and, pardon? Oh, and I'm sorry, the Leominster Land Trust. They too have jurisdiction over a lot of this property. So there are a lot of different people involved, a lot of different organizations, and I'm going to repeat them. There's the DPW, the City of Leominster, of course, the Leominster State Forest, the Trustees of Reservations, and the Leominster Land Trust. Of course, and it goes all the way to Shoalin Farms. This area connects to Shoalin Farms, and many of you have walked that distance. There's the end, right? You've walked the distance from here to there. So what I'm going to talk about is mainly the northern portion of Notown. We're still having more customers come. Huh? Well, the acreage is about just under 5,000 acres. It goes 3 miles by 2.5 miles. And in the census of 1790, that was our first census, on the 2,000 acres that were assumed by Leominster, there were about 84 people living in here. That's all. In all of those 2,000 acres. Excuse me. But they didn't stay long. One of the most unique people that lived here at that time, actually his parents bought it in 1766, was Joe Palmer. And I've given a history of Joe Palmer to Deanne. And Joe Palmer lived just in the edge of Notown Reservoir. It wasn't a reservoir at that time in history. The reservoir was established in 1850 by James Carter. The reason I'm saying all this, remember that Mr. Carter, one of the members of the commission, wrote a lot of this history. Speaking about the history, besides Chet Carter and Evelyn Hashey, also a Father Bartlett. I'm learning about him. Now, he was associated with the St. Leo's Church. I've just recently come across that information. Do any of you know anything about Father Bartlett?
Well, I belong to St. Leo's, so I know Father Bartlett.
You know of him?
Boy Scouts.
Is he still alive?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, Father Bartlett is still alive. Okay. Well, he did a lot of history. He roamed around this place. But I've just recently came across that history that he put together. Very interesting. Well, to get back to Joe Palmer, all of you know the history, I'm sure, of Joe Palmer. If you don't know the history and you want to understand that history, that's all you have to do is go to Harvard, to Fruitlands Museum, and you'll find a great deal of information about Joe Palmer, because he bought Fruitlands Museum and he gave it to the Transcendentalists. And of course they were from Concord. And not only are there artifacts from Notown there, but also Indian relics are there also. Are any of you familiar with Fruitlands? Yes, so you know what I'm talking about. If you've been through this area and you want to understand a little more in depth, then I suggest you go to Fruitlands. And of course the Unitarian Church was involved with Joe Palmer, because they brought him to jail in Worcester, and the Unitarian Church in Leominster went to Worcester and demanded he be released just because he grew a beard. I mean, it was a silly thing in the 1840s, and if you want to see a picture of him on a stone, he's in Evergreen Cemetery, and I'm sure many of you have seen that already. Okay? Now I'm trying to recall some of the information I've put together here for you. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about was this is, and I mentioned right in the beginning, sacred ground, because it's been isolated for so long, and the settlers used it, the Native Americans used it, but it hasn't been used. Other than the reservoir and the quarry, and other vehicles passing through here, it's been an isolated area. Now, as you go up the road and start to walk, and you get on the top of the hill before the power lines, on the right-hand side, there was the Stearns property. And the Stearns property housed a lye-stone, L-Y-E. I don't know if you know anything about a lye-stone, but it's usually 4 feet by 5 feet. It has a groove on the outside with a kind of like a little spigot on the end of it. It's not a spigot, it's how the material comes off of it. And what they would do in history, I don't know if you know this history, they would make lye, which is sodium hydroxide. And they would get that from oak trees. They would wash it down the slab of stone, and they would extract the ashes, evaporate the content, and they would end up with sodium hydroxide. Mix it with animal fat, and you end up with soap. Soap was a very essential item among the settlers. You couldn't go down to town and buy it. You had to make it. There's still a farm in Sterling on the south section of Notown, and it's called the Potash Farm. Any of you familiar with the Potash Farm? Well, potash is another name for sodium hydroxide or lye. Okay? Now, when I met with Tom Malstead, who is the archaeologist from the Department of Environmental Management, he looked at the stone and he said, it may not be a lye stone. It may be a chutter stone, C-H-U-T-T-A. And I said, well, that's a new word in my vocabulary. He said, besides making lye, they made cider. Cider or apples were a very essential part of the diet of the settlers, because with the cider they could make applejack. And applejack was easy alcohol, because how could they get alcohol that time in history? So cider or apples were very essential, and everybody had apples. And if you look at this hardscrabble land around here, it can grow apple trees, but not so much farmland. And if any of you are familiar with David McCullough's new book on John Adams daily would take in cider. Of course, he doesn't say anything about applejack, but cider was an essential item. Now, when you get on the top of the hill, and you'll be going with Peter, to the left of Stearns' cellar hole, where the lye-stone was a school. We're trying to figure out the number of the school. We know in 1855, there were 10 schoolrooms in Leominster, schoolhouses. Very similar to number 6. You're all familiar with number 6. Well, they had one right up here on the top of the hill. But we don't know the exact site. We think it's right in that area. And being on the Historical Commission, we try to find these essential government sites. And of course, the school is a government site. And that's our responsibility, learn the history of what the municipal or government sites are all about. So we're still going through this area, but we're lucky because we're going through with the state archaeologists. And here's the message he wants me to leave with you. Do not touch anything. Please. Don't dig around. You can photograph, you can walk, you can poke, but don't dig. This is state property, this is private property, and it's city property. And we want to keep it that way. And if we have people digging, and this message is not so much for you people, it's for the general public. We don't want people in here touching the sacred ground. Because remember, I said originally that the Native Americans moved through here and the early settlers. There aren't any left. The only ones that still occupy an area is on Palmer Road. And I don't know the name of them. Is that the name of them? And they live on the top of Palmer Road where Joe Palmer was born. That's the only site that we know of within the Notown area that's occupied privately. Most everything is just state-owned or city-owned because of the DPW. There are some houses on Elm Street, but we don't consider them part of the Notown area. Okay, that's how we're looking upon this. The other interesting area I mentioned earlier, there was the reservoir. You'll go by the reservoir. That was built by James Carter in 1850, and they did that purposely, not for a reservoir, but a source of water power. The other interesting factor is the granite quarry on South Manusnaut. That has unique stone in it. If you look at it, if you're ever going by, pick a piece up and look at the black crystals. That's only found on South Manusnaut, those black crystals. Obsidian or whatever it is. I don't think it's obsidian. And if you go around Leominster and you look at all the foundations in Leominster, or many of them, or the Unitarian Church, that's made from Leominster black granite. And that's unique. That's very unique to have a stone that is characteristic of just our local area. Okay. Also, these paths and these roads that you've come across, they were put in the 30s by the CCC. And over the years, I've talked to men in their 80s that worked here in Notown, and they had barracks in Notown. And they lived in those barracks. They didn't go back and forth home. And they worked all over Notown and Leominster State Forest. And also during the 50s and 60s, the National Guard played in the forest. And as you walk through the back roads and the side roads, you'll probably see some of their debris. You know, their leftover shells and all that kind of stuff. Because when I was a scoutmaster, I had to collect it all for my scouts. They would come in with ammunition boxes filled with blank shells. And that actually weren't blank. Yeah, they were blanks, but they were live. I had to collect them all from them. And I didn't realize that the Army was stationed. They used this area from Fort Devens. Well, just to leave you, people, enjoy your walk. You're going to go up to the power lines and down. And as you do so, you're going to come across cellar holes. And there were different families in town. Let me just read you some of the names of some of the families. Would you mind listening? I know I've been taking a lot of your time up. I'll just be a few more moments. Here are some of the names and these names you're going to hear over time as you look through the old Leominster records. Fairbanks, Maynard, Parmenter, Leggett. Leggett started in 1710. There was Willard, 1730. Flagg, 1735. Perkins, 1731. Wiswell, which was the owner prior to Parma, 1735. Stone, 1752. White, 1749. Stearns, the one that you're going to see on the top of the hill, 1750. Drury, 1750. Carter, 1750. And am I taking too much time? No. Okay, one little vignette, okay? I'm going to read, and I have to put my glasses on to read it. This kind of tells you a little bit about the occupants, okay? The occupants of the area. The Stone Grant. This grant is another incident in the history of the attack upon New Hampshire in 1690. Lieutenant Bancroft, commanding a company recruited from Reading, Andover and vicinity, met the enemy at Exeter, New Hampshire, July 5th, 1690. Excuse me. In this engagement, Simeon Stone of Andover was severely wounded. In a petition for grant of land in 1738, he says that during the fight, your petitioner had the misfortune to receive 9 of the enemy's shot in several parts of his body and was given up for dead for a considerable time. that after the fight was over, a party of Indians making a discovery of that person, what person was slain, happened upon the petitioner, and perceiving life in him, as he had been informed, gave him 2 very grievous wounds in his head with a hatchet. But the English, being near, had not time to scalp your petitioner. Notwithstanding of all his wounds to the good province of God, your petitioner, after great smart and pain, was cured of his wounds to the admiration of the beholders. For the truth of which your petitioner would refer himself to the history of those times, wrote by Reverend Cotton Mather. Some of you know that name, do you not? The Salem witches, remember that? Now this is Mather's story of an event following the information. At this time there happened a remarkable thing. Simeon Stone, being wounded with shot in 9 several places, lay for dead among the dead. The Indians, coming to strip him, attempted with 2 several blows of the hatchet on his neck to cut off his head, which blows added, you may be sure, most enormous wounds, unto whose portholes of death, at which the life of the poor man was already running out fast as he could. Remember, this is all English. I'm trying to put it together so you can understand it. And they were ready to scalp him. And the English showed up to bury their dead. One of the soldiers perceived the poor man to fetch a gas, whereupon a fellow then presented him with to be buried. And he said, he lifted up the wounded man, poured a little fair water into his mouth, and he coughed, and then poured a little strong water after it, which he opened his eyes. Well, having read the petition, Cotton Mather, the General Court, would not refuse his grant of the petition of 200 acres given to him in 1738. Okay, that was just a little aside. I wanted you to know about an individual here in town. I have a whole book on it, of all the different individuals, and they have very fascinating stories. When you walk around town and you're walking through the streets, those have changed in our lifetime, just our own personal lifetime. These have not. This goes back to 1675. That's a long time. When the archaeologist came out here, he was fascinated. He said, I didn't know anything like this existed. I said, we've been living with it. He says, can I come and visit? I said, anytime you want. He says, when the leaves are off the trees, that's when he'll come to visit. Then he can really see things. So already we're scheduling for him to visit in November when all the leaves are gone. And we will go through here. And of course, he has a 4-wheel drive. And he can go through all the state property. And of course, I, being a government agency, have the right to go through these roads too. Just for archaeological purposes. Preferably to walk. But as you can see, I have a cane. I'd love to be with you, but I had arthroscopic work done. And I'm just not up to walk that grade. And there's a grade coming up that's pretty steep, and I'd have a little difficulty. Peter, have I talked too much?
No, you haven't.
Thank you very much, people. I think Deanne wants to say something.
Now, there's a little bit of information that John brought.